All right, tribe, what's happening? Well, it is pouring down rain. I've recently given my Kawasaki Z900RS Cafe its third oil change. That's right. It's just coming up on 1,000 miles, and its third oil change is now in the books. And while I was doing that oil change, it got me to thinking, well, if I were to have put this bike together myself, what would I have done differently? And some of the answer to that question is actually in the modifications that I've made to the bike. Things that you can see straight away by looking at it. That Brock's Street Meg exhaust, arguably the best sounding exhaust period for any four-cylinder motorcycle, which is something that I really love about this bike now that it has that addition. But stuff that you may not notice, obviously the tail tidy or the passenger peg eliminators, or, well, maybe those little bar end mirrors, which to me, at least for rideability, is one of the biggest changes. The changes to the suspension, or you definitely can't see that Ivan's tune that's in the ECU, tooling all of this together to make this bike now a very spirited motorcycle. Some of the changes that I'm making, though, they really aren't changes that I'm making because of things that I quote unquote hate. But there has to be a things I hate video, right? Because if I don't put that video together, I'm just not a proper YouTubeist. So let me talk about some things that hate's a strong word, but let's go ahead and roll with it. So, riding the thing. First thing that you notice with this motorcycle is, well, how it looks. And in my opinion, the bike just doesn't really have the power from the factory that it should. About 111 horsepower and 70-something pound-feet of torque, that's a good amount of power. But for some reason, my mind and my eyeballs just can't really conspire to agree that that is quite enough horsepower. To me, somewhere in about that 130 to 140 horsepower range would probably have been ideal, which is why it's got the tune and the exhaust on it, and the airbox mods, and soon to be potentially those velocity stack modifications. You get the idea. So we've addressed the power situation, and now that the bike will put down somewhere just south of 120 horsepower to the rear wheel, or give or take 130-ish horsepower at the flywheel, we've bumped it up quite a bit. So we're in that right range now, but from the factory, I feel like it could have been a little bit better. And a lot of that has to do with the RPM range of the engine. Stock, it makes peak power around 8,500 RPM. Which kind of ties into my next gripe. It's the gearing of the thing. From the factory, this motorcycle is aggressively geared. First gear and second gear seem to be gone before you even get a chance to realize what you've done. And, well, it's got some nannies that are a little bit intrusive, especially if you're trying to roll on the throttle very quickly in first gear. In fact, you can kind of roll into a nanny if you roll into the throttle quickly in first gear and you're really not trying to do a wheelie, but it kind of does wheelies like that. And then you get some of that nanny intrusion, and it can actually kind of get to you real quick. It can catch you off guard, if you will. So that is a bit of a gripe for me. For a motorcycle that's only revving realistically or supposedly to about 8,500 or 9,000 RPM, it needs longer legs. It really does, to take full advantage of the torque that this engine is designed to make. So I'm addressing that with a slightly larger front sprocket. It'll give it a little bit longer legs in first gear, maybe help to mitigate some of that nanniness, and, well, it'll make it a little bit better on the highway, where the sixth gear has such a massive split from, well, fifth to sixth, as you would maybe normally be used to in a closer ratio gearbox. So, secondary gripe, maybe? Anyway, carry those legs a little bit further, and I think it would be a little bit better. And it walks in lockstep with the modifications that are done to the bike. Given the fact that it does have an exhaust, it does have the tune, the mods and everything else, the bike's making significantly more power, to say the least. So the gearing, well, it doesn't quite necessarily need it. Add to that the limiters have been removed that maybe would have helped to keep the bike a little bit more tame on harder throttle inputs. Basically, secondary throttle has been well, they're wide open all the time. And so she's getting all the air she can handle. Let's go ahead and tame that a little bit with that gear. Now, other things that I would complain about, I mean, you've heard everybody that's ever ridden one of these things spiritedly. The stock suspension isn't very good, and I'm still convinced that somebody got their math backwards because the rear is too soft and the front is too firm. Looking to change that rear spring. I weigh about 200 pounds once I've got my gear on, maybe just a little bit more if I'm being honest. And that rear spring just does not seem to be up to the task necessarily, but it's great for street use. It's a nice, compliant, comfy ride. It doesn't really upset me that much that it gives up a little bit of high-speed cornerability. And I use that term kind of, well, is it supposed to not handle well with these suspension settings? Because so far I can't really gripe, but I would like a little bit more rear spring rate. If I were to put one together myself, I'd have probably looked to maybe scale this bike more around a rider that's somewhere around 180 or 190 pounds, and maybe not necessarily 130 or 140 pounds, which is what it seems to be sprung to. At least that's my subjective way to look at it. So yeah, a little bit of a difference there with that suspension, but that really hasn't been the biggest gripe for me. Among all the complaints that I maybe could have with this bike, most of the complaints are the things that I hate, if you will. They're not that major. In fact, some of the things that I don't like about the bike, I've already addressed. And if I haven't addressed them yet, I've got some plans to get after it. The cool thing about the Z900RS and the Cafe is that they lend themselves very well to being a blank slate. You can take the bike stock and enjoy it. It's a fun bike, great city bike. In fact, the way that it's geared with its limiters, the power that it can make, and well, the way it delivers the power, if you left it stock and were basically more in like an urban type environment, it would make a great companion. In much the same way that a Speed Triple or a Bonneville T120 would be that same great companion. It's just a fun bike in that respect. But if you want to take this bike to another level, there are options. There are solutions. Again, the Brock's Street Meg exhaust sounds beautiful, looks fantastic. That Ivan's tune really wakes it up. Oh yeah, and I also put a G2 quick throttle on it. So if you want to know anything about throttle response, I've got an answer for you on that. So there's all of that that's included. I guess the one thing, if I had something to complain about, would maybe be the clutch and the gearbox. We talked about the gearing, but this bike does have a positive neutral finder, which can be a little bit weird. If you're not familiar with what that is, if you are riding the bike and you are at a stop, if you click the lever up, your shift lever up, it will only go as high as neutral. Not necessarily a bad thing, but just something that you need to know. In other words, you can't just start off in second gear unless you've left it in second gear when you come to a stop and you never click down at all. Now, that being said, it also seems to have a bit of, and I don't know that this is true, it's just been my experience. So if you guys have experience or knowledge better than me on this, post up in the comments and let me know what this is that the bike does. It's almost like the bike has an anti-money shift protocol going for it. In really hard downshifts, let's say you're coming into corners, you're riding very spiritedly, you're blipping hard, you're like 3-2 coming into a corner, and let's say that it's a corner that you could probably take at about 35 to 40 miles an hour, but you want to come out of this corner really hard, so you blip it down into first. It may not go into first. This can also happen when you're slowing down to come to a stop sign. Coming in really hot and clicking down through the gears, you'll get sometimes a flashing in. It basically locks it into neutral. Is it trying to keep you from money shifting it? Is it the ABS kicking in? I don't know, but what I've learned with this bike is that I just don't go down any further than second, and if I need to start off, I'll just put it into first gear. Don't know where all that's coming from. None of the other motorcycles in the fleet have anything at all like that in their protocols, if they will, but it's just something that I noticed. And if you're riding the bike really hard, it takes a really specialized scenario to find yourself in that situation, but you could, so I'm mentioning it anyway. I don't have any other gripes. The brakes have done really well for the playing around that I've done with the bike. The power is all there that I could ever possibly hope for, and really, honest to goodness, be able to use on the street realistically. Some folks have complained about the tires. I really haven't had a gripe at all with the tires. I run them at about 39 out back, 36 up front. Bike seems to like it. I enjoy it. So there you go. There's nothing really to hate about the bike. And again, I will say that the bike works extremely well as a blank slate, makes for a very fun hot rod. It's a standard though. It's not I wouldn't consider it an open class naked or a hyper naked. It's a very fun, very hot rod-ish standard bike. And as long as you keep that in mind, I think that this motorcycle is going to be a bike that you can keep for a very long time and you can have a ball with it. So with that, guys, post up your comments. Let me know what you think. If you've got one of these things, what are some things that have annoyed you about it? I'd love to hear what you have to offer. And with that, guys, that's a wrap. Adios.